Well, we turn now to another issue. Is the Trump administration attempting to erase history? On Friday, congressional officials confirmed the administration has begun returning to Congress copies of the Senate's explosive 2014 report on CIA torture. The move raises concerns that copies of the classified report will now be buried in Senate vaults or even destroyed, and along with it, lessons from one of the darkest chapters in America's history. Under the Obama administration, the 6,770-page landmark investigative Senate report was initially sent to federal agencies in the hope it would eventually be made public. Now the reports will be returned to the Republican-controlled Senate. Documents held by Congress are not subjected to laws requiring government records to eventually be made public. On Friday, the American Civil Liberties Union said in a statement, quote, "It would be a travesty for agencies to return the CIA torture report instead of reading and learning from it. As senators intended, this critically important investigation should have been made public."
Democrats are expressing fear that the Trump administration intends to erase electronic copies and destroy hard copies of the report. In a statement, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon accused the Trump administration of seeking to, quote, "pave the way for the kind of falsehoods used to justify an illegal and dangerous torture program," unquote. Throughout the campaign and since taking office, President Trump has voiced his support for torture. This is ABC's David Muir questioning Trump about torture in January.
Mr. President, you told me during one of the debates that you would bring back waterboarding and a hell of a lot worse.
I would do what I would do. I want to keep our country safe. I want to keep our country safe.
What does that mean?
When they're shooting, when they're chopping off the heads of our people and other people, when they're chopping off the heads of people because they happen to be a Christian in the Middle East, when ISIS is doing things that nobody has ever heard of since medieval times, would I feel strongly about waterboarding? As far as I'm concerned, we have to fight fire with fire. I have spoken as recently as 24 hours ago with people at the highest level of intelligence, and I asked them the question, does it work? Does torture work? And the answer was yes, absolutely.
So that was President Trump speaking to ABC's David Muir in January. The Freedom of the Press Foundation is now calling for whistleblowers within the Trump administration to contact the press before the Senate torture report is potentially lost forever. The group tweeted, quote, "If you work for the Trump administration and your conscience compels you to blow the whistle, you can use Secure Drop to contact the press." Well, for more, we're joined, continuing to be joined by Shana Katidal, the senior managing attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. CCR represents two men named as former CIA prisoners in the executive summary of the Senate torture report that was released in 2014. Majid Khan and Guled Hassan Duran are both currently held at Guantanamo. So, Shana, talk about the significance of what the Trump administration is doing with this report.
Sure. Well, it's certainly highly significant to individual cases, right? It's useful to go back a little bit, I guess, to remind ourselves what has been released and what we might still be waiting on, right? So in December 2014, after many years of struggle with the Obama administration over essentially redaction and classification review of the parts of the report, they release the 525-page executive summary, right, which shows, among other things, that techniques that were applied were much worse than what was revealed in those torture memos under the Bush administration, right, that it was applied against a lot more people than was previously discussed, and that group of people included at least 26 people who were wrongly suspected of involvement in terrorism, basically, right, against people who were, quote unquote, innocent, right? That the techniques exceeded the legal authorization that was spelled out in those memos, and that finally really nothing productive came out of the torture and detention program, right? That there wasn't actionable intelligence that came out of it, and that there wasn't cooperation induced among detainees, right? And that bottom line is, I think, the most important thing that probably remains to be reinforced by the 6,000 plus pages that haven't been released, that haven't been redacted into unclassified form and released publicly, right? We only know this because of what Senator Feinstein has said, but she says that the remaining portion of the report that Senator Burr is trying to bury, that the agencies are returning, contains a great deal more detail about the ineffectiveness of the program, how it didn't produce useful intelligence like the CIA claimed, and it responds in great detail to the CIA's own defense of the program. Then on top of that, we also know from Feinstein's cover letter to the executive summary that there are detailed chapters essentially on all of the 119 detainees. So this might be very useful in their individual cases, certainly might be useful in the sentencing proceeding of our client Majid Khan, who cut a plea and cooperate agreement, and potentially in the habeas corpus case arguing for his freedom for Khalid Hassan Duran, our other client in the CIA program.
Well, Burr is a longtime critic of the report, which he's described as disreputable and overly critical of the CIA and the George W. Bush administration. At one point, he called the report nothing more than, quote, a footnote in history. So could you explain why you think the Republicans are so averse to releasing this report, and what, we can speculate is in the report that might be particularly critical of them?
Right. It's a million-dollar question, right? I mean, this is a 6,000-plus page footnote. It was the product of 5 years of intensive labor by Senate staffers. The Senate Intelligence Committee voted almost unanimously to conduct the inquiry, 14-1 in 2005 when the whole thing got started, right? So it's really mysterious, why they want to bury it. And I think the only clue that we really have to it is what Feinstein has said about what's in there, which is precisely that it undercuts the CIA's argument that the program was somehow effective in producing intelligence, in disrupting active terrorist threats, in helping find Osama bin Laden. And, obviously with the Republican president out there extolling the virtues of torture once again in a way that would have seemed remarkable during the 2008 campaign when both John McCain and Senator Obama were saying that we needed to kind of move on from it. It's, I think, pretty clear that this is simply a partisan attempt to make sure that the public isn't exposed to the idea that torture doesn't work, right? Which polling data remarkably shows most people haven't even heard that statement. They haven't heard that argument.
Is there any chance, you think, given this opposition, that the report may eventually be released, or is it now a foregone conclusion that it won't? Well,
so no, there are 4 copies that are apparently being returned, all from intelligence agencies, basically the FBI, 2 copies from the CIA, and the Director of National Intelligence's copy. But there are 3 copies that are still out there, outside of the Senate's copies, right? One is with President Obama's National Archives presidential records. That can't be released by law, I think, until 2028. But that one's safe for now. Then there are 2 others that are being held pursuant to court preservation orders because they might be important to cases, one from the military commissions and one from the habeas cases. So those will still be out there, but it's obviously very difficult to get any record like this declassified. It took 4 years just to get that executive summary out under President Obama. So it's a long, long struggle. And, I think, one key point that you mentioned at the outset is we want the agencies to read this so that they learn from it and so that it never happens again.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange tweeted, "Trump, threatened by resistance, CIA alliance, gives CIA concessions from prosecuting WikiLeaks to hiding torture." Your response?
Well, I don't think, Trump needed to make concessions. His statements about torture seem, sort of crazy when we think back to the bipartisan consensus against it at earlier times. But, he may be crazy like a fox here. The polling data since the middle of the Bush administration shows consistently 2 things. One, that the public is unfamiliar with the idea that torture doesn't work. And second, that evangelicals strongly support torture, not because they think it works, but because they think it's justified punishment. And there, when you understand that, you understand the kind of evil genius of Trump's campaign statement that, sure, it works, and even if it doesn't work, they deserved it anyway.
Very quickly.